So we talked about it a little bit earlier with subprocessors. Typically, these are those downstream vendors that we talked about earlier. They could be called service providers or subprocessors. They could be called business associates, et cetera. But under a number of privacy laws, including GDPR, there are requirements that you can't just willy-nilly add downstream vendors whenever you want, right? And typically, the way that you might see those is you might see provisions on the contract that, Kate, you were talking about this the other day. They call them contractors. But if you're a SaaS vendor, like you might not have contractors per se. It's really about the downstream use of information from whoever you're contracting with. And some of the typical ways that you'll see organizations handling this, proposal of new downstream vendors is through something that's called either general authorization or specific authorization. Let's talk about specific authorization first. That's really simple. That is, let's say I'm performing a service for Dave, and I say, Dave, yesterday I was using Amazon for my hosting, and tomorrow I want to use Oracle or Microsoft or somebody else for my hosting. I'm going to tell you who that is. Is it okay for me to shift over? And Dave gets to decide if that's yet okay or not. That's basically what special authorization is. You'll see that frequently referred in a contract as like, thou shall not, send data to a third-party subcontractor or subprocessor without consent. This is really a scale issue for a lot of organizations. And it sounds really good if you're the customer and you give somebody paperwork that says that. But for companies in, for example, the SaaS space, where they're selling COTS, right, commercial off-the-shelf goods or software, that doesn't really scale or work, which is why you'll see most of the leading SaaS companies in the world use general authorization. What general authorization is, and Kathleen spoke to us a little bit, so hopefully things are starting to click a little bit, is typically you will have a disclosure online of, and maybe in your contract, of who the present state vendors are or subprocessors that you're using. And then you will have some kind of protocol to notify if there's a new addition. Typically, that protocol involves, at a minimum, updating that web page to have the new ones, some period in advance. Typically 15 to 30 days is common. Most people don't really want just that. They want some kind of like push notification too. And so I would say that like a good practice to consider is providing through automation or through some kind of subscribe link, a subscription capability so that if you make a change to your subprocessor disclosure, you send an email to people saying, hey, we've changed this. You have a period, let's say 30 days, if you have any concerns. And typically the process goes that if somebody does have concerns, they have the ability to object. And then you will typically go into some kind of like adjudication period where you either can work around their concerns, not use the vendor for that person, or in worst case, often people will offer a termination right if they can't kind of overcome those challenges. I think that in my experience, and yes, somebody asked, would a downstream vendor include AWS, Google Cloud, et cetera? I mean, the short answer is it depends on how you're using them. But if you're using them to host your software service and they're handling data on behalf of your clients for you, then yes, they would be considered a downstream vendor. Anything else to add, folks?
I guess as well as Kathleen and Kate, I mean, how do you see customers objecting when adding a new subprocessor? And how is that? Any anecdotes on how that works out?
I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I've never gotten an objection,
Same.
but so
Same, by the way, same.
Yeah, no, and I mean it's like I that sort of reinforces what I thought, which makes the whole thing a little bit what are we negotiating over here, right? Like at the end of the day, we're not you're not going to add some like if you're a reputable company, you're not adding some fly by night entity. And so, it reinforces some of the comments at the outset about sort of like what's the maturity of the organization and like, let's sort of be practical here as we negotiate some of these provisions.
Personally, I think there's a little bit of chest beating going on with this provision. I think it's one of those things where you're absolutely right. And I think that, when you're talking to somebody like the folks on this call, Kathleen or Kate, who have, worn multiple hats in an organization, they know that. But I think if you're speaking to somebody whose sole responsibility is supply chain management or like reviewing privacy agreements, they might not have the wherewithal to appreciate that point, right? It might be somebody else in the organization. And that's where there's a little bit of challenge because you have this person who's got these really defined parameters. And I think that speaks back to the dynamics point where like your process is your process. If you are a SaaS company with hundreds or thousands of clients and somebody comes beating their chest and saying, no, I want specific, I want to consent to each one of these, it's a scale issue to be able to say yes to that. So even if they really want it, unless you're choosing to re-architect your business, there are going to be serious challenges with you actually committing to that.